The moral argument for God is kinda unique. From a logical perspective, it's one of the weakest arguments that apologists use. But on the other hand, it's also one of the most emotionally compelling arguments. And I think we're going to see that today as Dr. Craig wraps up his defense. Hey there, folks. Bert from the Barely Bearable Atheist here, continuing our series on the book On Guard by Dr. William Lane Craig. We've been going through Dr. Craig's presentation of the moral argument for God, and we just got done listening to him try to defend premise number 2, his claim that objective moral values and duties do exist. So now it's time for him to try and address possible objections to his argument, to, try and debunk them. And kind of surprisingly, he's only going to try and address one single objection out of all the different problems you'd expect folks to point out about what he's presented so far. I don't know if maybe Dr. Craig just didn't think of them or forgot about them or flat out didn't want folks to notice them, but he don't even mention them. So I figured that maybe we ought to take a few minutes and look at the objections that Dr. Craig leaves out just to make sure we've covered all the relevant points. And the first one is the existence of conflicting moral standards. Dr. Craig's argument, as he presented it last time, is that just like we all experience the same objective physical reality, we all also supposedly experience the same objective moral reality. And the evidence he presents in favor of this claim is that if you ask whether it's wrong for the church to cover up pedophile priests, pretty much everybody's going to say, yeah, that's wrong. The problem is, this ain't something that's consistent across different folks and different moral topics. The reason Dr. Craig mentions pedophile priests and don't mention homophobia is because he ain't going to get universal agreement about homophobia the way he can with pedophile priests. And that's a serious problem for his claim that we all allegedly experience the same objective moral reality. If there was an objective moral reality that we all experienced in common, we'd expect everybody to have the same moral experience. But we don't. And in fact, that's what all this culture wars controversy is about. To use Dr. Craig's terminology, different folks experience different moral realities, and that does more to disprove his claim than to prove it. And granted, he can try and hand-wave this discrepancy away by claiming that other folks' moral experience is marred by sin or some such. But that's a heads-I-win, tails-you-lose argument. Claiming that every counterexample is due to sin is just a trick to make his claims unfalsifiable. And unfalsifiable claims don't tell us nothing about the truth. So that's one objection that he don't try to handle, and perhaps understandably so. And the second objection is this. It's a mistake to jump from the fact that folks claim certain things is objectively wrong to the conclusion that objective wrongs actually exist independently of subjective opinions, because that don't follow. Now granted, there's some issues that folks has some pretty strong opinions about, especially when there's moral issues. And when we has strong opinions, we'd like them to have a lot of weight. In fact, we'd like it if other folks accepted our opinions as undeniable fact. So we has a tendency to make the exaggerated claim that our opinion is an undeniable fact. It ain't strictly true in a technical sense, but phrasing our opinion in those terms is emotionally satisfying and does a pretty good job of expressing just how strongly we feel about it. So when we's evaluating folks' opinions about right and wrong, we need to take that into account. Somebody having an opinion about whether some particular moral judgment is an undeniable fact ain't the same thing as the moral judgment being an undeniable fact. It's still a subjective opinion regardless of what we try and call it. And that means that we can't take some random person's opinion as proof that objective right and wrong exists just because they claim something is objectively right or objectively wrong. On the other hand, the fact that we do have strong feelings about particular moral topics does a lot to explain why the moral argument for God is so emotionally persuasive, despite its logical flaws. It put folks with strong moral opinions on the horns of a dilemma. If we claim that there ain't no such thing as objective moral values, then we can't claim that our strongly held moral values is objective fact. And for a lot of folks, giving in and saying that, okay, objective moral values exist, well, that's the lesser of two evils. They don't want to give up their strongly held moral opinions, but they ain't confident in their ability to justify those opinions other than just calling them objective fact. So they're just going to give in. And not to put too fine a point on it, but that's emotional blackmail. The apologist is going to take advantage of the fact that a lot of folks, and maybe even most folks, ain't going to have the skills needed to deconstruct the moral opinions and present a sophisticated defense for their moral judgments. It's easier just to call it an undeniable fact and to rely on the fact that most of the time nobody's going to seriously challenge it. And that ain't to say that it's impossible to give a well-reasoned defense for why something's right or wrong based on empathy, social sensibility, and a consideration of the consequences. In fact, it ain't really all that hard once you put your mind to it and once you learn a few basic concepts of moral analysis. But that's new territory for a lot of folks, and that's what gives apologists a weakness to exploit. So that's the second objection that Dr. Craig don't address, and let's do just one more before we move on to the one he does address. And the third objection has to do with the incoherent nature of this supposed objective moral reality. Dr. Craig repeatedly uses the phrase moral experience and says that we ought to trust our moral experience to tell us about so-called objective moral reality, just like we trust our five senses to tell us about objective physical reality. And the problem is that moral experience ain't really the right term. The correct term is moral intuition. And I suspect that in other contexts, that's the term that even Dr. Craig would use in talking about how we perceive moral values. The only reason he don't use that term in discussing the moral argument for God is that moral intuition is subjective. It can be different for different folks, and it ain't always consistent with itself even for the same person. And you can see that if you ask Dr. Craig to explain what the objective moral truth is concerning the rightness or wrongness of slavery and homophobia and incest and genocide and genital mutilation of babies and on through the list of nasty things condoned and commanded in the Bible. On the one hand, Dr. Craig wants to agree with most other folks that these things is wrong. But on the other hand, he can't say that there's some objective moral standard that God violated by condoning, commanding, and committing these things in the Bible, because that'd make God look bad. And if folks lose respect for God, he's going to lose respect for folks like Dr. Craig. And there goes his career. So Dr. Craig has to try and mash together some kind of have your cake and eat it too morality that lets him claim that such things is wrong, but it was right somehow for God to allow or command it. Except, of course, for the homophobia, according to Dr. Craig's moral intuition, that's fine, even though God himself happens to be a same-sex union. It's just a big, jumbled up, incoherent mishmash, just like you'd expect from subjective moral intuitions masquerading as objective moral experience. And you can't make an argument for God out of that kind of confused nonsense. So, yeah, there's lots of objections you could raise to Dr. Craig's moral argument for God, including more that I was leaving as an exercise for the viewer, and Dr. Craig ain't even going to mention them. So let's go on and have a look at the one objection that he does try to address. Quote, "The question, then, is, do we have any overriding reason to distrust our moral experience?" End quote. And that ain't even the objection he wants to address yet, but let me just interrupt right here for a minute because I want us to notice the assumption he's making here. He's assuming that our default attitude ought to be to trust our moral intuition, whether we has any justification for it or not, unless someone can come along and prove that it's wrong. In other words, the burden of proof is on whoever don't just take our word for it. Whatever seems right in our own eyes is right by default, unless and until someone else can prove that it ain't. So all we has to do to cling to our beliefs is to say that we ain't convinced by the other person's argument. And the fact that he calls this quote-unquote moral experience instead of moral intuition is misdirection designed to reinforce the idea that so-called objective moral reality is just as real as objective physical reality. So right from the get-go, he's shifting the burden of proof. Let's keep going and see what the objection is that he thinks he has a good answer for. Quote, some people have claimed that the sociobiological account of the origins of morality undermines our moral experience. According to that account, you'll remember, our moral beliefs have been ingrained into us by evolution and social conditioning. Does that give us reason to distrust our moral experience? End quote. Let's just take a minute here to appreciate the expert apologetics craftsmanship it takes to set up a presentation that's so meticulously balanced to achieve just the right framing to make it sound like he might have a point here. He's set it up so that the reader is led to assume that their so-called moral experience ought to be trustworthy by default. And he's making it sound as if skeptics is trying to undermine the reader's so-called moral experience, like they was some kind of saboteur out to throw grit in the gears of a well-tuned machine. And that's why he's leading off with the idea that subjective moral intuitions is some kind of moral experience that's analogous to how our five senses perceive objective physical reality. Except, of course, that even Dr. Craig himself began by agreeing that our five senses is fallible and can lead us to mistaken perceptions, even in the physical world. But somehow he don't never raise any similar caveats about our so-called moral experience. Go figure. This is a highly targeted setup that's tightly focused on the believer's own personal subjective worldview. The believer wants an argument they can use to claim that their own moral opinion has the weight of objective, undeniable fact. And Dr. Craig is putting them in the right frame of mind to think that it's perfectly okay for them to do that. The problem is, what happens when you look outside of that tiny bubble of Christian presuppositions? What happens, for example, when you discover that a lot of folks, and maybe even most folks, hopefully, has moral experiences that tell them that it's wrong to persecute LGBT plus folks just for being different in ways that don't hurt nobody? Would Dr. Craig insist that those folks ought to trust their moral experience? Would he accuse Christians of trying to undermine the whole idea of objective morality by telling non-Christians that their moral experience was untrustworthy? Dr. Craig's answer here is most likely going to be that when folks say homophobia is wrong, it's because their moral experience has been tainted by sin, and that's what's leading them to false conclusions about what's moral and what ain't. Well, the problem with that is that if our moral experience can be tainted with sin and lead us to the wrong moral answers, then that's precisely a reason to distrust our moral experience. This notion that we ought to trust our so-called moral experience by default is an idea that's directly contradicted by the Christian gospel itself. But meanwhile, a sociobiological understanding of the origins of morality ain't even an attempt to undermine this so-called moral experience that Dr. Craig is preaching. It's just a rational understanding of where morality comes from. Usually, if a debater's going to address objections to their argument, they at least bring up actual objections to their argument. But a secular understanding of morality ain't an attempt to disprove objective morality, just like a study of geography ain't an attempt to disprove the flat earth. All he's trying to do is understand the reality that we all experience in common. It ain't that the sociobiological account aims to refute objective morals, it's just that it provides a simple, reality-based explanation of morality that don't need all that extra hand-waving about some kind of objective moral reality where goodness is somehow based on the nature of a deity who has historically promoted genocide, homophobia, animal sacrifice, racism, slavery, misogyny, incest, etc., etc., etc. According to some feller named Occam, a simpler explanation is more likely to be true than is a claim so full of inconsistencies and self-contradictions that apologists can make an entire career out of trying to explain them all away. So even though the sociobiological account ain't directly aiming to disprove Dr. Craig's claims about objective morals, it kind of does that anyway just by being a more reasonable and parsimonious explanation. But speaking of apologists trying to explain stuff away, let's hear how Dr. Craig tries to make it sound like he's successfully dodged this particular bullet. Quote, "The sociobiological account clearly does nothing to undermine the truth of our moral beliefs, for the truth of a belief is independent of how you came to hold that belief." End quote. And that's quite a dodge, all right. The rules of engagement, as defined by Dr. Craig himself, states that in order to defeat his argument, you has to undermine moral experience as a valid way to know moral values. In other words, it's about the reliability of how you come to hold your moral beliefs. But now here he's talking about whether or not your beliefs is true, which is an entirely separate subject. He goes on to give examples of getting your beliefs from a fortune cookie or from reading tea leaves, just to show that even unreliable methods can sometimes lead to conclusions that's true. Well, that ain't what we's arguing about here. He himself specifically made this an argument about whether or not we can trust how we cling to our beliefs, not about whether or not our beliefs might possibly be true. So this is a classic example of hand-waving and misdirection. He's sneaking in a change of subject so he can make a few points that's technically correct, but ain't relevant at all to the topic he defined in the topic under discussion. And even if it was relevant, it wouldn't do his argument no good because there's a huge gap between saying something's trustworthy and saying that in some cases it might lead to answers that might coincidentally be correct. Yes, you can construct fallacious syllogisms that happen to end in conclusions that's coincidentally true, but that don't mean that fallacies is a reliable way to reach the truth. But let's see how he tries to tie this red herring back to his original point. Quote, "If God exists, then objective moral values and duties exist regardless of how we come to learn about them. The sociobiological account at best proves that our perception of moral values and duties has evolved." End quote. So once again, the burden of proof is shifted. It ain't up to Dr. Craig to prove that so-called moral experience is analogous to our experience of physical reality. It's up to skeptics to prove, to Dr. Craig's satisfaction, that it ain't. And his argument here is that the sociobiological account don't disprove objective morality. But you know what? That's fine. It don't need to. Dr. Craig concedes here that moral perceptions could have evolved, and that's all we need. 100% of our so-called moral experience consists of us having moral perceptions. That's why when he tried to find some evidence for objective morality, he asked folks about their moral perceptions. That's the only evidence that could exist for moral values and duties. So the existence of moral perceptions is all that the sociobiological account needs to account for. We don't need to assume the existence of objective moral values, so we don't need to account for any such thing. And not only does the sociobiological account explain the existence of moral perceptions, it also explains why some moral perceptions is common to a lot of folks while other moral perceptions is different depending on who you ask. And the existence of conflicting moral perceptions is something that Dr. Craig's argument can't explain, or at least not without adding some additional stipulations that make his whole argument unfalsifiable. Our moral experience is trustworthy except when it leads to conclusions that I disagree with. Heads I win, tails you lose. Yeah. So-called moral experience ain't trustworthy. You gotta test it just like you gotta test your observations in the physical world. You can't just assume that whatever seems right in your own eyes is necessarily some kind of undeniable fact. From here, Dr. Craig moves on to what, in my opinion, is the absolute silliest argument that apologists make. And it goes like this. Quote, similarly, the objection is that if our moral beliefs have been shaped by evolution, then we can't have any confidence in them because evolution aims not at truth, but at survival. End quote. And honestly, I have a hard time even wrapping my head around what the argument is supposed to be. Is Dr. Craig saying that the result of millions of years of selecting for the most successful populations is somehow going to produce a species that can't trust its own perceptions? How's that supposed to work exactly? There's a fundamental misunderstanding here of how evolution actually works. Evolution don't just select for survival, it selects for traits that best enable the flourishing of a given population. And accurate perception of reality has huge practical benefits for a population. Evolution ain't aiming at any particular goal, but the way natural selection works, it's gonna favor traits that help a species tell the difference between what's real and what ain't. It ain't gonna be perfect, but then that's why we need skepticism and science to verify our perceptions. We can trust our perceptions to a point thanks to evolution, but beyond that, we has to test them. And by the way, Dr. Craig phrases this as if it was an objection raised by skeptics, but I ain't aware of any skeptics who actually make this argument. This is an apologetic argument that he's attributing to skeptics, but it's actually his argument. Quote, I myself pressed this point in defending premise 1. If God does not exist, then the sociobiological account is true and our moral beliefs are illusory. End quote. So this is Dr. Craig's own argument, which he is falsely attributing to skeptics. And since the whole thing's just a straw man, all he does is just turn around and say, well, that don't mean the sociobiological account is actually true. And besides, Romans 2:15 says God wrote his law on everybody's heart. So even though it looks like moral perceptions evolved, really they did. In other words, he rejects a reality-based explanation that parsimoniously accounts for everything that needs to be accounted for, and he substitutes a creation myth giving an invisible and unfalsifiable deity all the credit without actually explaining nothing. And his conclusion from all this is that therefore we have no reason to distrust the assumption that whatever seems right in our own eyes is objective, undeniable facts. Quote, apart from the assumption of atheism, we have no reason to deny what our moral experience tells us. End quote. But don't worry, if in someone else's moral experience contradicts our moral experience, it's still okay for us to deny what their moral experience is telling them. Yeah. And just to drive the point home, Dr. Craig plunges headfirst into the heart of the silliness of this argument. Quote, given the truth of naturalism, all our beliefs, not just our moral beliefs, are the result of evolution and social conditioning. Thus, the evolutionary account leads to skepticism about knowledge in general. But this is self-defeating because then we should be skeptical of the evolution account itself. End quote. And he says that like it'd be a bad thing. But here's the thing. Skepticism means we don't assume that something is true just because it seems true to us. We test our beliefs and verify them against the standard of objective reality itself. And then we only accept the conclusions that pass the test, like evolution does, for example. That's an approach that's been so successful that even apologists want to claim they're being scientific. Sometimes they'll even claim to be skeptics. We all know that our unexamined assumptions and perceptions ain't infallible, and they's wrong often enough that we get significant value out of looking at them with a skeptical eye. Like the skeptic usually says, skepticism is the first step towards truth. So Dr. Craig's attempted criticism backfires. Instead of casting doubt on the sociobiological account, he just done showed how precisely and accurately it describes objective reality. And that, plus the fact that it accounts for all of our moral perceptions, including the conflicting ones, means we don't need to look no further. And that, at long last, is the end of Dr. Craig's attempt to defend the moral argument for God. Taken as a whole, his argument is essentially just a creation myth, arbitrarily giving Dr. Craig's personal favorite deity credit for the existence of moral perceptions without actually explaining nothing useful about morality. And his whole approach is based on claiming that the default assumption ought to be that whatever seems right in his own eyes is an undeniable moral fact, unless and until somebody can prove to his satisfaction that it ain't. Needless to say, that's just an exercise in self-righteous self-justification, and there's no reason why anybody else ought to have any respect for it. And I'm sure there's more that could be said, but that's going to about do it for me for today. Next time, we're going to open up the next chapter in Dr. Craig's book, but no spoilers this time. If you want to find out what the next topic is, you'll have to tune in. Ain't I a stinker? Meanwhile, thanks for watching, and please be kind wherever possible.